This war and its devastating consequences have affected many, from individuals to institutions and political conglomerates. For some, it has been a critical point to reassess one's creative endeavors and positioning, and moreover, relation to power structures, fragility, and complexity of how language, symbols, and narratives are created and used. Since we're touching upon sensitive topics, I would kindly ask everyone to be respectful and thoughtful to other participants while contributing to the discussion. Also, feel free to have your cameras on from now onwards, but please mute yourself until we start the Q&A session so we can pose a question. You can also write a comment or a question in the chat or DM lecture series on Instagram. Tonight's panel's discussion will aim to generate clarity on mechanisms of disinformation and propaganda in the realm of the war in Ukraine. We are welcoming 5 panelists, and I will start by shortly introducing them all. The panel will be moderated by Anna Engelhardt. Anna is a research-based media artist and writer. His primary interest lies in the colonial approaches to cyberspace, which he advances in his PhD on Russian cyber warfare as a colonial enterprise. Her investigations take on multiple forms of media as they develop over time, including publications, videos, websites, and physical objects. And the panelists are Lera Malchenko. She's a journalist and artist from Ukraine, a member of an art group called Fantastic Little Splash, founder of a media research art project, super-mova. Then we have Svitlana Matviyenko. She's an assistant professor of critical media analysis of Simon Fraser University. Her research and teaching are focused on information cyberwar, political economy of information, media and environment, infrastructure studies, science and technology studies. She's a co-founder of 2 collections, The Imaginary App and Lacan and the Post-Human. Also, she's a co-author of a book, Cyber War and Revolution, Digital Subterfuge in Global Capitalism. Then we have Lee Mcintyre. He is a research fellow in the Center of Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, formerly executive director of the Institute of Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. He previously taught philosophy at Colgate University, Boston University, Simmons University, Tufts Experimental College, and Harvard Extension School. He's the author of a book, Post-Truth, along with numerous other works, including The Scientific Attitude and How to Talk to a Science Denier. And finally, we have Oleksiy Radynski. He's a filmmaker and a writer based in Kiev. His films have been screened in the International Film Festival Rotterdam, Kurzfilmtage Oberhausen, DocuDays IFF, the Institute of Contemporary Art London, Savvy Contemporary Berlin, and many others. He received a number of festival awards, and he co-founded a visual culture research center, an initiative for art, knowledge, and politics in Kiev. We had to shorten the extensive bios of our wonderful panelists, since we would like to dive into the talk right away. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this brilliant introduction. I wanted to say that there's not going to be that much of a live discussion between us today. So I'm just going to ask questions.
Anna, we don't really hear you. We have a bit of a technical issue.
Check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, maybe it was a bit of a lag. Yeah, I wanted to introduce you briefly to the content of what's going to happen today. It's not going to be more of a live discussion. I'm going to ask questions to the panelists, and I really urge you to do the same. We're going to have a dedicated Q&A session in the end, so please keep that in mind while we're going to be talking. And I'm going to start today with my first question to Svitlana. Svitlana, would you mind providing a broad definition of cyberwar that could give us a sort of a toolbox for our today's conversation? As a part of such cyberwar inventory, please elaborate on the cyber in William Gibson's Neuromancer, online ads, fake news, and personalized cyber attacks. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and also thanks to all organizers for this interesting invitation and such an interesting composition of this panel, which I hope will end in a quite interesting exchange, and we can learn from each other's work. And yes, so in this question, I see at least two things that I think important to emphasize. One, as I define cyber war, I will emphasize and I will explain its difference, at least like the difference of the definition that I and my co-author proposed in our work from how cyber war is usually defined in military and security studies, because there is an important difference. And another emphasis that I will make is precisely in relation to the mention of William Gibson, because it might be strange that suddenly a sci-fi author is brought in the conversation about this matter. So to begin with, how we understand cyber war and why we think it is important to distinguish it from cybersecurity and military specialists. So the notion, of course, the notion of cyber war has quite a long history, and it's rooted in cybernetics of the mid-century. However, the notion didn't come kind of into any kind of debates until maybe 80s, or if it did, it wasn't quite popular. So, but then, so it belonged very much, in fact, military and security discourses, specifically military, right? So when with the development of cybernetics, there were some first speculations somewhere in the 70s and the 80s in the United States, mostly, maybe like in the realms of Rand corporations and other think tanks like that, when with the development of cybernetics and technology, there was an attempt to envision a new kind of warfare, the warfare that would be automated, because cybernetics and cyber here in cyber warfare actually points to a complex communication between different systems and the question of automation. So that is one important aspect. If we look at how cyber war was defined through the 80s and 90s and later, we would mostly see kind of like the emphasis or the attention to the attacks, right? So the attacks on critical infrastructure, all kinds of cyber attacks, hacking and leaking and things like that, right? So we speak about information systems, we speak about all social, political and other systems being interconnected and informationalized, and therefore they become vulnerable. They become in a certain way open, right, for certain attacks. This in the military security discourses of, like, let's say, previous decade, cyber war was very often imagined as interstate affair, right? So it would be usually state against state, right? So we people would speak about attacks, like, for example, by China or by Russia or something like that. However, the way how, with my co-author Nick Darisford, we wanted to interject, we wanted to engage with all these discussions, is that we wanted to broaden the definition of cyber war. And sometimes we are even reproached for making it maybe a little too broad. But I think it's quite important, in fact, to see it as broad, because what we want to emphasize is the role of kind of the realm outside certain visible conflicts, right? So here broadening the definition of cyber war allows us to think about shifting battlefield, the role of regular user being used in the war as a relay sometimes for passing or sharing some information, or for technology to being hijacked and used as some nodes, for example, in swarm attacks, etc. Right? So in a certain way, maybe we will need to produce some other kind of like understanding after broadening this definition, but we thought it is important to show how the realms of war and peace actually came together. And in a certain way, I think it's actually quite an important event of modernity. Modernity also showed to us that the border between war and peace becomes more and more blurry. And in a certain way, cyber war, any kind of cyber war event also is quite symptomatic of modernity in general. So that's, and of course, our definition is a political economic definition because it shows that it's not only competition and contestation between different states. In fact, the variety of actors of cyber war is quite surprising, right? So they can be states, they can be corporations, they can be some random smaller organizations, they can be armies associated with certain states or with several states. They can be distributed armies or groups, and they can be absolutely random and solar hackers and actors, right? So, and that adds another complexity to, understanding of certain conflicts and the development and spreading of certain events of disinformation, different attacks, and things like that. And of course, again, this is a political economic war, right? So this is a war over power of the internet, right? Redistribution of the power of the platforms, internet, all sort of digital resources, and so on. And in a certain way, we could say, as we do in the book, that cyber war as we see today is also a possibility for rebooting for capitalism, right? So as just it did many times before through different technological revolutions. So that is in terms of cyber war. And very briefly, I just mentioned a comment on the Gibson situation and why suddenly sci-fi author is mentioned here. So it's interesting indeed how sci-fi, especially Gibson's Neuromancer, where cyberspace is used for the first time, gave what this imaginary to the thinkers of cyber war of the 80s, right? So cyberspace as a word was first introduced, not even in Neuromancer, but in another short story of Gibson that didn't become popular actually, but it was reused again in Neuromancer and became such a hit, a hype word basically. And again, this sci-fi imaginary was very much adopted, right, and used by theorists and thinkers, and gave certain material to them to use in terms of terms, in terms of imagining this strange and in a certain way terrifying new realm that posits new threats and probably creates new possibilities for conflict.
Thank you very much, Svitlana, for this answer. If you can briefly mention maybe like the uncanny personalization of what's happening now with the war.
Yeah, having been writing and thinking about cyber war for some 5 or more years, I must say that what we see now is one of the most intense materializations, obviously, of what we can call cyber war. And there is one thing that is particularly important for me is that I do call the current war cyber war, but it doesn't mean that by doing this, I'm emphasizing or putting forward the cyber dimension, because cyber war, as what we defined it, is the intersection of kinetic and informational. And in fact, the role of kinetic, the role of real blood and flesh, is primary for cyber war. It just cyber emphasizes the automated aspect of certain things, visibility of the subject, transparency and non-transparency of certain things, the possibility for certain disinformation events that unfold with a new speed and so on, right? So in this sense, what we see today is that full-scale cyber war, where we can see how certain disinformation event, and it came, right? So on the premises of, on a big disinformation kind of, reason, right? So cause and etc. So it actually unfolds in this reality of this bloody conflict, right? So this bloody invasion. And so in this sense, I actually, maybe it's a little even too early today, but I've been noting and thinking about new dimension of this intersection of digital and kinetic during these 2 months all the time.
Thank you very much. And I think in this on this note of disinformation operation, I wanted to bring up that in 1991, French philosopher, who probably some of you would know, Jean Baudrillard, claimed that the US invasion of Iraq did not take place. Baudrillard, famous for his theoretical work that questioned the so-called realness of human experience, stated that as soon as we don't see the war is not taking place. Some follow his narrative of simulation today in discussions of the Russian invasion. What strikes me in such a statement is that even though it is critical of US or Russia, it does not define who are the we that do not see the war. This we is Eurocentric. If one abandons such a Western-centric perspective, it will become clear that there are many direct experiences of war mediated through cyberspace. Lera, in your recent text called I Noticed the Extension, you discuss different ways the experience of war is broadcasted online. Would you please provide more context on how media interfaces host silence and distort the sounds and images of invasion? Which impressions of war platforms are the worst at mediating?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Really, it seems impossible to reread these days essays by Baudrillard from Ukraine now, because they are lacking in living experience here and now during the war. And it seems to me that there are a lot of such distortions in the mediating of this war, and maybe I have to start with traditional media, with the television in particular, and everything basically works exactly the same way, just as Baudrillard wrote about it. This is unfortunately traditional for television, especially for war correspondents, looking for spectacularity, and they can manipulate through video editing and framing. And but also now in Ukraine, for example, because of this urgent of spectacular backgrounds, some foreign journalists violated recommendations of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense about the impossibility of filming missile impact sites. And why the Ukrainian media didn't report anything at all about this, foreign ones simply providing the lives, and stand-ups, filming the stand-ups against the background of such heat places. And the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine has repeatedly stated that this could lead to additional losses among civilians, but foreign journalists often neglect this. And even if this tactic of the Ministry of Defense requires additional revision, maybe, I think it's a place for professional discussion, for professional journalistic discussion, I mean. And this because I think they have no fear about these people as their people, and just do their work looking for bright, remarkable images. And part of the same TV content is distributed online on social networks, on the professional media accounts, only now faster and even more effectively packaged for social media consumers. For example, if background music is usually unacceptable in the news, then in the caption video format into which TV stories are remade, this is almost always a mandatory element. And I think you know that online in your feed, this feed actually simply mixes all this news with conflicts in other so-called developing regions, with sporting events, sensational celebrity news, and so on. This is how the feed works. And on the other hand, we see Russia, on the contrary, creates the appearance that in Ukraine its army is tactfully sterile and purposefully destroying so-called Nazis. This is an absolutely emasculated reality, and anonymous Telegram channels in Russia, which create the appearance of an informational alternative, repackage the same Kremlin messages and play them in their channels for money. And at the same time, here in Ukraine, all this is felt intensely. And for sure, regular Ukrainians use social media for different formats. Now, for memes, maybe mostly Instagram and Facebook, yeah, because memes, I think today, for us, for Ukrainians, maybe this is the one of the strongest weapons against the Russian propaganda and the fakes, and also some songs and sounds, usually spreading through TikTok, and for sure we use it for documenting this war and mediating from the front line, from occupied regions, from more safer places in Ukraine. And now, for example, we can watch these photos and videos from Azovstal in Mariupol, where people are surrounded and we cannot help them. And it feels like a terrifying reality show, but it's not show. And for example, it has no way out, and we mediated it to each other through this collective body full of pain and exaltation. And this is all very similar to the idea of techno-ecologies of sensation described by Luciana Parisi. When you are a part of some collective body, connected not just mentally, but also through social media, air raid alerts, as Svitlana wrote before it, for example, and you are a receiver and transmitter of signals, digital signals, mental, and your body reacts, and you relay it further. And it looks like it can be broadcasted outside in this essence. And for example, after the discovery of the bodies of those killed people in Kyiv region, in Bucha, Borodyanka, Matizhin, and a lot of other cities and towns in Kyiv region, all the Ukrainians shared these photos and in videos, and almost the entire Ukrainian Instagram feed was blurred. It's no surprise that Instagram blocked photos and text. A day later, the texts were unlocked, but it felt painful and disgusting. Ukrainians just started posting screenshots of such blurred screens. And here I want to show you some of these screenshots. Yeah. It was made by Ukrainian designer and artist Sonia Sam, and she called it the box of pain. And yeah, it's just one of them. She posted such a screen that all Ukrainian users could see. She called it a box of pain, and it's actually felt like box of pain, closed and dark and painful. And also Ukrainians users wrote in sarcastic manner that many from outside will not know about the genocide of Ukrainians, not because we do not have enough evidence, but because our evidence does not comply with Instagram policy. And the blur itself seems to be such a visual metaphor for what is happening here. And the more Ukrainians try to spread these photos to be heard and seen, the more occasions of excessive emotionality came. And such occasions are heard from the West more often now in propositions to give up, for example. And maybe here I want to tell that in another popular text of his, Baudrillard wrote the reality of the simulation is unbearable. And if we use this quote in relation to this situation, then I see it this way. This is the simulation goes to the Russians. This is a simulation about the special operation, the justification, and so on. And this unbearable reality goes to the Ukrainians. And I mean that sometimes for sure we are trying to retranslate this reality, because sometimes with it we can retranslate the terror actually in all these images and videos. And but it's not because we want other sufferings, it's because we need support. And about this situation of simulations and realities, I'm not saying that Ukrainians are free from illusions or delusions or simulations. I think everyone had them. But if we are talking about Russia's invasion in Ukraine and about the role of Ukraine, then for Ukrainians, this role is quite clear here. It's not about something utopian, you know, it's something about surviving physically and existentially. And if it seems to someone that there is no war or no genocide in Ukraine because somebody told so on the state TV channel or wrote in anonymous Telegram channel, or because Instagram blurred this, or because it looks like reality show between ads, then this just say that such a reality is unbearable, but unfortunately it exists, and we live here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lera. And I think the point of like some people like choose to believe in propaganda rather than are fooled by the propaganda is a very important point that I would love to stay with. And in particular, that despite the overall narrative is that Russian people are maintained brainwashed by the state-run media, it seems there's something else at play apart from the budget of the TV channels. Even though we do not know exact numbers, it is striking that the invasion of Ukraine has much less support in Belarus than in Russia. It seems unlikely that the reason lies in the quality of the propaganda or the differences in the narratives, because there are not many, which are notoriously badly made in both Russia and Belarus. Oleksiy, what do you think makes the invasion gain more support in Russia than Belarus? We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. I hope you can hear me now. So yeah, thanks a lot, Anna, for this question, and special thanks to the organizers for having me here and having us all here. I think it's a really interesting constellation that's both familiar and surprising for me. And yeah, I don't know even where to start with this one. I think I have to start with kind of specifying from where I speak at this moment and as whom. Yeah, so I'm not a political scientist at all, and I don't have, unfortunately, I have much less knowledge about what's going on at this moment in the society of Belarus than I would love to have, that I would love to really know more. Unfortunately, this knowledge is quite limited to us here. I also have a quite limited and possibly also distorted knowledge about what's going on at this moment in the Russian Federation. But still, I would like to claim that at this moment, I'm speaking as a kind of a post-colonial or a decolonial subject in a way. I'm now in Kiev, Ukraine, where I was born and raised. And I've been born and raised as a bilingual that is both Russian speaking and Ukrainian speaking subject. That kind of makes me become aware of my kind of post-colonial and decolonial legacy since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine that started on 24th of February 2022. I also very much feel myself as a target of this invasion because I realized that I belong to a community of people that is basically subject to extermination by the Russian forces in Ukraine. That is basically as like, even though I'm in the framework of the Russian military, I am a Russian-speaking subject that they're supposed to protect, right, from the alleged excesses, yeah, and with restrictions on Russian language. It's very clear that I am very much part of the community that has to be eliminated in order for the Russian invasion to have any kind of success here. Yeah, so which is brings me a long way to an answer to an attempt at least to answer the question, and I'm really thankful again for bringing up Belarus and the people of Belarus in this discussion. And I think I think this question could be answered very quickly and in a very kind of simple or simplifying way. And I think that the support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine in Belarus is very low or much lower than it is in the Russian Federation, simply because Belarus is actually a colony of Russian Federation, while Russian Federation is the metropoly, or basically the imperial or the neo-imperial center from where these neo-fascist, neo-conservative, and neo-expansionist policies are carried out from. Yeah, and while the Republic of Belarus remains basically a colonial, in colonial relationship with the Russian Federation, and this also, I think, opens up a very important perspective on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is very much often overlooked. And this is the colonial or the neo-colonial or the decolonial, actually, perspective on this invasion. And I know, just as a disclaimer, I was also supposed to give a very simple definition of colonialism during my answer, which I'm sorry, I'm not gonna even try to do, because I think that rather than when we speak of colonialism these days, especially in the context of Eastern Europe and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we do not really need simple definitions. What we really need is a much more complex definition of colonialism than the one that's been established in the Western academia in the last decades during the advent of the post-colonial discourse. Yeah, we need to really kind of rethink and make it more complete, make the understanding of colonialism and what it implies more complex than it actually is. And the reason for that is that like years before this full-scale invasion of 2022, me and lots of my colleagues were kind of trying to use the decolonial discourse to explain or to conceptualize what's going on actually between Russia and Ukraine. And I think it was clear to many of us that we were met with a kind of misunderstanding of this context in the Western academia. And I think the reason for this is that the Western patterns of colonialism that are very well known to post-colonial discourse and to decolonial activism and so on, they do not exhaust, they do not really kind of cover those modes of colonial discourse and action that's been utilized by the Russian Empire and its current iteration that's called the Russian Federation, right? So the post-colonial discourse or the decolonial discourse mostly is based on the experience of European or Euro-Atlantic colonialism, which has always or most of the times been the maritime colonialism, yeah, where it had between the metropole or between the imperial center and the colonies, you would normally have a kind of an ocean or a sea or these kind of atrocious colonial practices were taking place on a different continent, basically, where you also had kind of different races, and there was a huge legacy of racism that was always kind of went together with the legacy of colonialism. Whereas the Russian Empire, yeah, starting when it emerged, yeah, and when it became like really active in the territories of today's Ukraine, which is around the 17th century, actually. This was a bit different kind of colonialism, which was still based on the very much similar premises of white European settler colonialism that was expanding eastwards rather than westwards, as this kind of classical Western colonialism did. And that was basically colonizing peoples, of course, not in every case, yeah, but in some cases, it was colonizing peoples of the same color, of the same skin color, with so you had basically the colonizer and the colonized were of the same skin color. In some cases, of course, not in every case, because the Russian Empire, as we all know, also had a very important racial component to it, yeah, and it's been colonizing nations of Turkic descent and of many other Ugro-Finnic descents and so on. But in case of the Russian colonization of what is now Ukraine, you had this a bit distinct version of colonialism that was colonizing the nation of the same skin color as the colonizer, and there was no sea or ocean in between them, which unfortunately makes it strangely difficult to the current decolonial or post-colonial thinking in the Western academia to comprehend this as colonialism, which it still was.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very comprehensive approach to the definition of decoloniality in regards to Russia. And I'm glad it was not actually a simplistic one. I wanted now, as soon as we also, thanks to Oleksiy's introduction, clarified our positionality as well. And also just a brief introduction that I'm Russian myself. So I'm now giving a word to our American speaker, and I wanted to ask you, Lee, that not only Russians are susceptible to the war propaganda. Russian disinformation campaigns have somehow resonated with the US, although the two countries are presented as the opposite of one another. What can be more opposite than Russia and US? Lee, would you please explain what are the tensions in the American politics that make Russian disinformation resonate so much with the American audience?
Great. That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to the organizers and to my fellow panelists. It's an honor. I can't think of a more important topic than the war in Ukraine. It's important to remember that the Russians have been targeting Americans with disinformation for decades. This is most obvious through scientific topics, though it's amazing how many people don't know this. Putin's regime has been spreading disinformation about HIV/AIDS, about GMOs, about climate change, about vaccines for the last 20 years in the United States. There's a terrific article on this in the New York Times called Putin's Long War Against American Science, because he wants to attack the trustworthy institutions and get Americans to distrust science, which we just saw happen in the outbreak of COVID. It's important to remember that the goal of disinformation isn't just to state a falsehood and to spread it, but to really amplify it, to really make it take hold with a larger piece of the population. And the best way to do that is to exploit existing fault lines. So I think that one thing that happens with state-sponsored disinformation, mostly from Russia, in the United States these days, is that they try to look for areas in which we're already divided and then exploit those. One of them with science, others are race, crime, other issues like that. I'll say a little bit more. The goal of propaganda isn't just to create false belief, it's to polarize the community. And it's important to remember that's a goal of propaganda, because some people are going to believe it and some people won't. And you can create a sort of tribalism, a sort of team around that. It's us against them. So propaganda is intended to create divisions and to create distrust in people for the people who don't believe the same thing that they do. So we're choosing up sides like you would on a basketball team. Who's on this team? Who's on that team? And propaganda is intended to do that. So it may seem odd that Russian propaganda about the war in Ukraine would resonate with conservative American audiences. But you have to remember that we were already being targeted with Russian disinformation and polarized for decades before this happened. Now, it's important to remember that then propaganda, disinformation isn't just meant to brainwash people. It's meant to tell them a message that they already want to believe is true. And so if you can find those fault lines, then it's much easier to make people get further and further polarized over time, so that people become willing participants in this effort to fool them. Now, this happened quite obviously in the United States around the 2016 election. It was no secret that Vladimir Putin didn't like Hillary Clinton, didn't want her to win. He wanted Donald Trump to win. And there were enormous efforts at disinformation and propaganda during the 2016 campaign. There's great controversy in the United States over this because the propaganda was so successful. And of course, part of the problem of propaganda is that it doesn't just spread a falsehood, but it tries to pretend that it's the truth. And so, it makes people think polarized around the issue of whether the thing that spread is even the truth or not. Everybody knows there was a huge investigation in the United States government. Robert Mueller put together a detailed report outlining the Russian efforts to helped Trump in the 2016 election. The evidence is all there. But as I say, it has become controversial in the United States because of this team building problem, this idea that the Russians were on the conservative side. Now, this may be shocking or it may not. I don't know how much people know about this. But in the United States, there was a popular T-shirt worn by Republicans, worn by conservatives, that said, I would rather be a Russian than a Democrat. Now, I think that pretty obviously says what the teams are, okay? That's not where the Republican Party used to be, but that's where the Republican Party is now. The perception amongst conservative Republicans is that the Russians are on their side. And this gets amplified every night when the fool, Tucker Carlson, goes on Fox News and respreads, amplifies Putin's talking points to a conservative American audience. And the ultimate irony here is that Tucker Carlson's broadcasts are then rebroadcast in Russia on state TV. So there is this very tight nexus, I think, that is very odd to think of. If you look back at American history and Russian history, you look at the left-right split, but there is this very odd nexus right now between the conservative Republican Trump party and the Russian government, such that you see the alliances that you see today. And I want to make a very important point here. It's that it works this way in Russia as well. Just to hark back on something that was raised in the previous question, I think that a lot of American TV commentators seem to feel that if we could just get the truth to the Russian people, they would understand what a liar Putin is and rise up against him and overthrow him. But that's not the problem. I mean, it is probably for some people, but that is a naive way to think about it. We have a free press in the United States. We don't have the kind of censorship, the kind of state television. And yet we have 40 or 50% of the American population that thinks that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. We have all these people who think that the January 6th protesters were Black Lives Matter or Antifa. Why do they believe that? It's because of propaganda, and it's because they want to believe it. And I make the claim that it works that way in Russia as well, because there's a shocking percentage of Russian citizens who prefer Russian state TV. That's before Putin kicked out the independent media. There were still people who wanted to watch Russian TV, state TV, maybe because they didn't want to be exposed to the truth. Isn't that what happens on Fox News here in the United States? People would rather believe a lie that fits their ideology than to hear a truth that makes them feel uncomfortable. So I think that's where the nexus is, because there really is quite a bit of similarity, I think, in terms of the team that they're on. Not the policies, not the ideology, but the team that they're on between conservative Russians and conservative Americans.
Thank you very much. And I definitely agree with those kind of similarities that you highlighted. And I think also I wanted to highlight another narrative that is being rebroadcasted both inside the Russia and inside US and Europe. And this one of the most commonly spread fake narratives is that Ukraine and Russia are the same. Either they're presented to be on the same note as a part of the broader region, which is Eastern Europe, which is obviously not the case because Russia is an imperial power in the Eastern Europe, but also the same as literally the same country, nation, culture, etc. Examples of these fakes are numerous, starting with the recent Putin speech that claimed that Ukraine never existed, and going as deep as a myth of so-called Russian avant-garde, which consists majorly of Ukrainian artists. Oleksiy, in your recent eFlux publication, The Case Against the Russian Federation, you dissect in detail the fake of Ukraine is the same as Russia. Would you please recall your line of thought from that piece?
Yeah, sure. Of course, I would like not just to recall this line of thought, but also to update this line of thought with regards to the developments of the last couple of months, basically since this essay was written. And I think it's really important, and thank you for reiterating this point from the arsenal of the Russian propaganda that claims that basically Russians and Ukrainians are part of the same community or nation, or as Vladimir Putin himself put it in his pseudo-historical essay called On the Unity of Ukrainian and Russian Nations. And I think after almost now 3 months of full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we can also corroborate these claims of the non-existence of the Ukrainian nation with the actual and factual kind of claims of genocide, or at least concerns of genocide of Ukrainian nation that are being voiced by international lawyers and scholars at this time. And I think that this is exactly the point where we can link the Russian propaganda and the Russian so-called fake news and the Russian basically media machine to actual hate crimes, or even kind of crimes against humanity. Or I also maybe think that we should basically start kind of calling things with their names, and the name of this policy or of this politics that were announced as part of this pseudo-historical claim about the united history of Ukrainian and Russian nations. And this name is actually fascism, yeah, because like one of the things that we know as fascism historically, or one of the definitions even of fascism, I would say, is a denial of a right to exist to a certain political group or a certain ethnic group or ethno-political group. So what we are actually seeing and experiencing at this moment now is an explicit and open case of fascist politics that has been carried out by the Russian Federation, and that basically kind of relies on the claim that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. Therefore, those Ukrainians who do not think that they are actually Russians, or that they should be the subjects of the Russian Federation, should be exterminated. And this is, if you follow, like in case you've been following the Russian propaganda since February 24, and even before that, because a lot of these claims were made by Putin himself in his declaration of war, this kind of pseudo-historical lecture that he delivered on Russian television. So a lot of these claims have been openly made by the official Russian state agencies, yeah, official Russian media, kind of media agencies that published pieces about that basically had openly kind of calling for the genocide of Ukrainians. Of course, not every Ukrainian, but just those Ukrainians who don't want to obey the Russian army. And for those who survive, they were kind of calling for the establishment of re-education camps where those kind of Ukrainians would be basically converted into the Russian nation. So if that's not fascism, I don't know what's fascism. And it's like one aspect of this that I really have to stress, even though it's unrelated kind of to what we're talking about, is that this is not just fascism. This is the fascism that also and this is very much related actually to what we're talking about, is fascism that relies on the inflation of the anti-fascist discourse in the form of the takeover of the anti-fascist discourse. Yeah, because like, as you probably know, the Russian invasion of February 2022 was justified by Vladimir Putin as a campaign of so-called denazification of Ukraine. Yeah, so there are some kind of people in Ukraine who are Nazis and they have to be eliminated and so on. So, I think it's a very dangerous development in the fascist discourse of today. Yeah, this kind of reclaiming or claiming anti-fascism on the side of the openly fascist Russian government. On the other hand, this is also something that the fascists were always doing. Yeah, historically, during like in the times of Nazi Germany, basically the German kind of Nazi regime served as a spoiler for socialism. Yeah, so they were basically like one of the biggest historical functions of Hitler's Nazism was to discredit socialism. Yeah, and to basically create some kind of fake socialism that was called like national socialism. In the same way, it seems that today's Russian fascism is kind of taking over and reclaiming the discourse of anti-fascism, which is a very big challenge for anti-fascists all over the globe. Yeah, I think that anti-fascist discourse, of course, should not be abandoned in any case. It should be reclaimed back from like these guys. Yeah, and I really hope that the international anti-fascist solidarity and anti-fascist communities have a potency to reclaim this discourse and to not let this fake and false denazification discourse to be allowed anywhere near the anti-fascist activism, of course. Yeah, so yeah, just to because it's a really big question right now.
I want to
yeah, so, I'll just finish with one small story on one basically incident that I came across recently, and I've been talking to a bunch of international lawyers who are now investigating Russian war crimes in Ukraine, and there's of course like one of their biggest focuses is something they refer to as concern of genocide. Yeah, so there's actually, it's been voiced many times, yeah, that the Russian troops in the occupied territories are actually carrying out genocide against Ukrainian nation. And of course, we have to be really careful when we use this term genocide, because we don't want it to get inflated. Yeah, we don't want the term genocide, yeah, to be used colloquially, of course. And we want to be really serious about that when we use that term. And what really struck me was that those international lawyers that basically professionally investigate war crimes. So they basically said, of course, yeah, there's a grave concern of genocide in Ukraine. It's going to be really difficult to prove this in international court at this moment, at least. But the reason for that is, for this difficulty, is that it's really hard to establish the connection between the calls for genocide that are voiced in the Russian state media and the actual activities of the Russian troops on the ground. Yeah, and that's what, okay, yeah, that's really, that sounds really sad, because like of course this is something that is hard to establish in court, but if this is the biggest concern if this is the biggest concern of the international lawyers to investigate genocide, then I think that on kind of our on the level of our understanding, we can be actually very much sure that there is a fascist genocide of Ukrainians by the Russian troops taking place in Ukraine, and this is happening due to a massive propaganda campaign on the side of the Russian propaganda media.
Thank you very much for updating the piece. I think it's a very important analysis, and also I'm glad that you introduced the factual narratives that you're hearing from the law discourse, because I think somehow in our culture it's perceived as the most valued objective reference. I wanted now to refer my next question to Lera. Lera, I think you can give us an extremely interesting perspective on how digital environments can mediate the closeness and proximity. And I mean closeness here not only to the space of war, but also to each other. And describing the film Armed and Happy, you did as a part of a Fantastic Little Splash collective, you state, the ability of social media to capture emotions and retranslate them, turn emotional contagion into a close collective practice, and the community into a single organism capable of achieving real change. This form of collectivity, which develops on the basis of digital interaction, can have very different consequences, end of quote. Would you mind elaborating on those consequences?
Thank you. Yeah, when we talk about this online proximity, I immediately want to talk about collectivity online. And collectivity is now an important part of our daily experience, and it's certainly very militarized. But at the same time, it is a mental need to be together, and between these states, I think this collectivity is felt. Many write now that they live between hatred and love. It seems to me that this is also about these collective emotions, where the individual is erased in mass mobilization, maybe in gender scenarios, and we all become some kind of single organism that defends, survives, and attacks. And that's what makes it so hard to go back to something very personal. It feels like shame and betrayal. I think this is how our emotions were militarized. And also this collectivity is enhanced by this mediatization, what I was talking about before, this constant co-presence with each other. And here I want to include in parallel this work, which you mentioned before. Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm just going to introduce briefly that Lera is going to show an excerpt from the Armed and Happy film that you can search for online as well.
Are you see it or not? Okay, I can do it in this way. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, and this is this series Armed and Happy, which I made as a part of Fantastic Little Splash Collective with my partner there, Alexander Hans, and it was a part of a series Armed and Dangerous, started by Ukrainian artist Oleksiy Radynski. And our specific series, as I mentioned, was called Armed and Happy, and maybe because we were trying to capture just this state between hatred and exaltation and how this can be shaped by various collective online practices, from the most harmless to the very militaristic. And for example, here you can see some child blog, but really when you watch it with the sound, it's terrifying. Okay, it's so about emotional contagion. Yeah, in this work we also told about emotional contagion. And what is it? Emotional contagion is the ability of social networks to convey emotional states. You don't need to be near a person to convey your emotions. And there were several studies, some of which were not very ethical, actually, because users didn't know that they were being manipulated with their news feeds in Facebook. But in the end, this possibility of transmitting emotions online was proven. And in this work, we are trying to capture this essence of these online practices in sport events, packaging, or maybe some of these child blogs, you know, all of them so emotional, so immersive. And maybe if we talk about this exaltation now, after the start of this full-scale escalation, maybe then it's most remarkable in a lot of daily militaristic collective online practices. For example, commenting on Google places together, or how people do it, uploading photos of dead Russian soldiers to reviews of Russian restaurants, for example, or the collective collapse of ratings of unfriendly, unscrupulous businesses in Google or Facebook, or in group commenting on the posts of institutions and politicians, and or in participating in the DOS attacks from a home PC, or in participating in a wave of memes on certain informational occasions. And in this complicity, we are these cyber soldiers, self-mobilized as it's war. And we can, it's interesting that I think we can also see how this collectivity defends itself through the self-censorship of the participants. Self-censorship is always a tricky issue, but that's what we can see now. And Ukrainians are much less critical to each other on Facebook, it seems to me, although it usually seems to be one of the favorite national activities in Ukrainian Facebook, to criticize each other. And now even the military, who often face dangerous bureaucratic problems that can really hurt them, hardly writes about it, so that the Russians can use it against us. And therefore, accordingly, it's not surprising that Russians online are aiming, among other things, at contracting such self-organizations. For example, one of the most common methods of Russian troll factories and provocations now I saw in small local Facebook groups. I constantly see such posts in local groups in some cities, Ukrainian cities, that receive displaced Ukrainians. And it looks like this way. Someone writes a frankly provocative post, someone takes it for truth, and someone works out objections, and it's run. And I think that this is that way of propaganda, Russian propaganda, which Lee mentioned before, about divisions and polarizing. And it looks like one of the most desirable goals for Russians online is the polarization of communities here. The division into Western and Eastern Ukrainians. And there is a feeling that now Ukrainians are less likely to fall for such provocations, but perhaps because of the already mentioned self-censorship. But this is just my subjective feeling. I'm not supported, it's not supported by some data or something like that. And so I think that closeness online now, it now seems both forced and necessary at the same time. And it's easier for everyone to live together, and only together we can live it. And social media seems to be the perfect space for such practices. So I think we can have some results of this kind of creations. I think that how to get out of these collective states, return to yourself, or overcome self-censorship, move away from emotional contagion, or learn to consume less emotional content again. You know, I think we will have to decide it after, maybe after these processes. But now it feels this way.
Thank you very much, Lera, for a very interesting inside perspective also on this closeness that is not very, I would say, sensed outside or like broadcasted outside, because it's like also very hard to mediate, I imagine. I wanted now to address a question to Lee. Lee, to bring in a conversation a bit of viewers' agency. What have you found to be the valuable tools someone could use against the Russian disinformation in the US?
Okay. The most important weapon that you have in fighting an information war is to admit that you're in one. And I think that in the United States, there are a lot of people who don't realize that we're in an information war. Just to expose the roots of the disinformation campaign in the United States right now would be tremendous. I'll give you an example. How many people know that this ridiculous claim that there would be microchips in the COVID vaccines was created by Russian intelligence? They invented it and they pumped it out to one of their English language propaganda arms in April 2020. It was called the Oriental Review. And the story was pure fiction, but at the bottom it said share on Twitter, share on Facebook, which a lot of people did. By May 2020, 8 months before the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were invented, by the way, CBS News did a poll and found that 44% of Republican voters thought that any future COVID vaccines would have microchips in them. Now, this was made up. This was completely made up, but that is tremendous saturation in the American market within just 1 month. But to expose that, you know, the people who are still walking around saying, oh, I don't want the vaccine because I think it might have a microchip. How many of them know that that was created in a Russian troll farm, that the GRU helped to pump that out through the Oriental Review? Not very many people know that. I think that we need to tell more stories like that, but there are also other steps that we can take. The main problem here, I think, the main thing that we can do about disinformation is to find a pinch point at its amplification. It's very hard to keep people from creating disinformation. It's very hard to keep people from believing disinformation once they hear it. So I think that the best possible thing we can do is to figure out how to keep propaganda and disinformation from being amplified. It's no secret that these days, most of that amplification is done through social media. And the social media companies so far have been quite free to share disinformation. They control their own algorithms, which, you know, they can tweak in any way that they want. They say that they're set for engagement, not for maybe for truth. Well, the problem is that those algorithms are, you know, even if they're not intending to spread disinformation, they can be very harmful. And I think that one thing is that the American Congress can pass a law which says that those algorithms have to be inspected by American academics and worldwide academics to figure out whether they have potential for harm. There's another very important thing that we can do, and this everybody can do, not just the people in Congress or people in government. And that's to, one of the best ways to fight disinformation is to pre-bunk it. Okay, you've all heard the term debunk, but pre-bunk is to go after something before it's said, to inoculate, like a vaccine, before the false story comes out. Imagine if that false story about COVID had been pre-bunked, if somebody had, you know, knocked it down before it got so wide. And there's plenty of academic work now which shows that pre-bunking works, that when you get out ahead of a false story, It's much easier to pre-bunk it than to debunk it. And I'll close with an example from the war in Ukraine. In the very earliest days before Russia had attacked Ukraine, there was worry that they would find some pretext, something that wasn't true that was going to allow them a false reason to go in. And everybody was concerned about this. But what did the Biden administration do? They came out and with specifics about it. Instead of just hiding it in their intelligence agencies, one of Biden's spokesmen came out and said the Russians were going to create a false flag attack. They had saboteurs in Ukraine. They were going to film a video showing alleged Ukrainian atrocities, and they were going to use this as a pretext for war. Very interesting thing happened. Once that was amplified, because the truth can also be amplified, when the video came out, very few people believed it. So that was an extremely effective thing to get rid of the amplification of disinformation, was to pre-bunk it, get out there in front of it. That's how you fight disinformation. You have to combat it by getting the truth out early and telling it over and over. That's how disinformation wars are fought. That's how the American army and every other army in the world fights disinformation war. There's a way to do this. But right now in the United States, most people are asleep. Most people don't really realize that we're in an information war and that we need to be doing this.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a very important point about the role of like intelligence and like the information war that was unraveling before the escalation and also on the Russian side. And I wanted now to finish the panel with the question to Svitlana. Svitlana, as a long-standing researcher of cyber warfare, do you feel a qualitative change in the subject, in your subject, before and after Russia escalated its war this February?
I do not see particular change, but I see some intensification, so maybe a little bit stronger developments that still did have some prehistory in some decades before. And one of them that I'd like to mention is the intersections, the nexus of cyber and nuclear. But before I do so, I also want to a little bit comment on the disinformation and give one example, which is related to what Lera was saying and Lee, and that has to do with the idea that I've been thinking a lot, especially through these 2 months, and this is about one of the targets, one of the things that someone wants to win during a cyber war or any war is the audience. So the audience itself becomes something that can be won and then used as a resource for a variety of things, especially in cyber war, can be mobilized, militarized, and whatnot. And here is very interesting. That's precisely what Lee was saying about polarization, because polarization as pretext for creating those audiences, right? So you polarize and then you have a group, right, of people. And of course, Lee was speaking about conservative audiences, but I've been observing this quite particularly interesting case with, of course, Russia Today corporation, how it managed to literally work with progressive audiences. And that was quite interesting for me, because I think what's important here also to think about and distinguish in how those things work is to differentiate between kind of like the tactical and strategical means that are used. And here we can speak about disinformation having kind of like long time goals, strategies that really time consuming and should be done over decades to prepare certain audiences, to gain the trust, for example. And then you can do and work with them very fast, just throwing tactically certain items, right? Certain almost weapons, etc., that could mobilize these audiences very easily. And that's what I think what Russia today, for example, was doing, because among many kind of, things that were told through those channels, there were quite many really progressive relative critiques, right? So either of government, American government, or other kind of government, etc., etc. And they were absolutely fair, right? So you could quote literally those things. And that's how, but I tend to claim that this media has no ideology. And this is another thing, right? The question of ideology is something that we really need to think about when we discuss disinformation, right? So in this case, it almost seems to me that those critiques were produced not because someone believed in some necessity of neoliberal critique, right? But because they knew the audience needs to hear this, right? So, and also Lee mentioned that the beliefs of the audience, something that audience knows, concerns about, etc., right? So either environmental things or neoliberal things, etc., right? So the left audience, a progressive audience of the Canada and the US was completely kind of, gained by this resource. And then it was so easy, again, to work that audience also against, kind of make them very concerned about Nazism and Nazi in Ukraine, right? And because this audience already had a trust, right? A trust to this medium. And I think what distinguishing between what this long and short strategies of certain media, I think it's also very important. And if you see and always ask about who says why and when and what, so I think it's very important. And my things, very briefly, I will also mention again about this nexus of cyber and nuclear, which again, is still in development. We still do not know the end of the story. But that is, of course, about the occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. And here, again, to put this story together with what everyone on this panel was saying, there is a real legacy, imperial and colonial legacy there, because this infrastructure, the atomic energy infrastructure, was one of the kind of like dream stakes of the Soviet Union. And that is, of course, in the 70s, when all those Chernobyl station was built, and others started to be built in the early 80s and late 70s. So that was the dream of basically kind of rebooting the kind of struggling economy of the Soviet Union, right? So there is a lot of attachment there, emotional, affective, phantasmatic, imperial, and whatnot. And so this infrastructure is something that has been always in minds and fantasies. And as the director of Ukrainian Energoatom, Kotin, mentioned once in his interviews, that he knows and he heard it in the early 2000s, Putin really thought that despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, the atomic energy infrastructure has to be the one, and has to be with the office in Moscow. So in a certain way, this occupation was again going to those things that are attached to these imperial dreams right? And we're there. And what's also very interesting is that, particularly speaking about the Chernobyl nuclear power station, how this basically, it was not only the Chernobyl station, but other Cold War infrastructure like Duga, the radar was built there. It's like very close to different Cold War infrastructures. Those objects were installed in the areas where this native population lived with these old cultures, with this old language that wasn't even really Ukrainian, right? So it was very specific, and those securitization regimes attached to those objects really invaded these areas because they could, because they were operating on this colonial and imperial basis, right? And in a certain way, when I looked at it today, how those nuclear power stations were basically weaponized, right? So, and this occupation itself basically turned them into a nuclear bomb, potential nuclear bombs, right? Especially with all this shelling and vehicles being on the territory, on the perimeters of the stations, right? So that was incredibly dangerous. So it's like the infrastructure that was always advertised as producing peaceful atom, even though we know it was a lie, but it was advertised like this, right? So now it's again weaponized in this most terrorist way, right? So that really allows us to speak about nuclear terrorism with colonial and imperial roots.
Thank you very much, Svitlana, and ending on such an important political note, our discussion. And now I wanted to give the floor to the organizers, because I think we have some questions. And please reminding you about the opportunity to share those in the chat on Zoom as well.
Thank you so much for bringing this diverse perspective on these urgent topics. And yes, we do have a question. We have a question from Anna, and it goes, "Hi, I would like to open a discussion about a case of an American philosopher, Noam Chomsky, statement about invasion of Ukraine. He is an anti-war, anti-capitalist, and anti-Zionist, meanwhile commenting that Ukraine must surrender and the public should pay attention to reality of things. His case, in my opinion, well portrays the blind spot of the Western world, projecting their ideas of what state should Ukraine become, while silencing Ukrainian voices. Would like to hear panelists' take on this. Thank you." Maybe someone can.
If I can jump in quickly as a moderator, can I give the floor to Svitlana, just because I know she was writing about this particular case? And then obviously I know all of you have a lot to say about this. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, indeed. I think the publication of this interview and other interviews that came out around that time really shocked many of us by its insensitivity, right? Especially because the publication of the interview was 2 weeks after the events in Bucha and Irpin and many other small cities, right? I've been, again, what I think about it is that partly I see it as the legacy again, the legacy of this Cold War split that many people, especially on the left, still see the world as very bipolar. Although even, if I even think through with the notion of cyber war, here we are so much beyond some kind of bipolar world that this complexity really deserves our attention. And if many of people on the left in America were leaning towards kind of Russian position as an actor who opposes, let's say, Western imperialism, right? So, and invested very much in this. So I think it's one of the reasons that people still think along those lines, which does not allow them to see this very complex, multipolar kind of cyber war assemblage which is happening today. That's one thing I can say, but I also unfortunately think more and more recently this way, that Western left has quite a very quite strong imperial complex, kind of like not a complex, but imperialism embedded, even though it positions itself like as an anti-imperialism and imperialist thought, but there is imperialism there. And sometimes when I read those people, and myself, I am a left thinker, so I will say this. So for me, it specifically reads as a terrible kind of like betrayal and again, insensitivity. When I read like Russian imperialist discourse and Western left imperial discourse, they are kind of like the same. They really fit one another. And sometimes I really cannot understand why they are at war. They are in fact kind of like one discourse. And so that is one of the things I think to revise, to reread critically now and later, if I hope there will be if. So yeah, but this is one of the things, to revise certain notions, certain statements about, for example, about those big historical nations that have the right to consume smaller nations, and etc., right? So we really need some major revision in the lieu of this discourse of decolonialization and de-imperialization.
Thank you very much. Someone else wants to comment?
We have another question.
I was going to say, as an American
there is
philosopher,
this case of a Russian journalist, Marina Ovsyannikova, who is standing in live TV with a poster saying "Stop War," and then she was praised like a brave hero, and then later on hired by the German media. Maybe Anna, you can answer. How do you see the situation? How do we read this? Is this a move of a propaganda move, or is it just what is your perspective on this case?
Yeah, I wanted to give floor quickly to Lee to make the comment that he made, and then I can address the question.
I was just going to say, as an American philosopher, you would think I would have more to say about someone who was described as an American philosopher, but I don't. So please go ahead.
That's a plot twist. Yeah, I wanted to mention briefly about Marina Ovsyannikova. It's a very sad. How should I say? It's not surprising, but it's extremely upsetting to see it unfolding in real life. Like all the praise that she got, and even a job position, is upsetting for me as a Russian. I can't imagine how it is upsetting for someone who is actually Ukrainian. But I wanted to mention that it was crazy for me to see how the situation was unfolding in this information dense environment that we're at now. Because I saw when she just went out with the poster, a lot of people started saying that it was a disinformation campaign by the Russian state. And I think it's a very important moment to stay with it, because I think it's definitely not a Russian disinformation campaign, because Russian disinformation is not that smart to make this sort of statement as the mind game that is required to plan this sort of operation is not a Russian security officer type of thinking. Russian security officers question people who have tattoos, who just came out of Mariupol because they think that all people who have tattoos are the part of the same Nazi group. Like, these people are really dumb. For them to imagine, envision, and pull off such an insane operation campaign, be actually, it's actually giving them more credit that they actually have. And this is something like, disinformation works because it is dumb, because it appeals to the worst, like, stupid parts of us, I feel, rather than like this kind of genius mastermind, one person kind of amazing thinking. But yeah, I feel but also like this case is very potent to highlight how Western media is complicit in the Russian information operations, because even though it was not planned as an information, is a Russian propaganda, it played out as a Russian propaganda, because Western media takes on praise of Russian narratives in places where it should not. The amount of credit Maria got, and also other Russians are getting, for never been engaged in any criticism of the Russian invasion that has been ongoing for 8 years, never engaged in any reflection on their own colonial or like any type of positionality. They just said one thing that was bad, and now are like all of their legacy of problematic statements made before that has been forgotten. I think is a major problem. And Western media like Washington or like New York Times, Washington Post and New York Times, making interviews with the white Russian liberal males who have no idea of what's happening there, instead of like actual Ukrainian voices, I think is the part of this paradigm that the case of Maria Ovsyannikova highlights. Yeah, this is kind of my understanding as a Russian of this case.
If I may add to this just very briefly, I completely agree with Anna was saying. And what I want to indicate also here, myself, I decided that I'm not gonna decide about whether it was mastermind or not. I decided to bracket with this particular thing. And what was more interesting for me is to observe the response, right? So either amplified naturally or unnaturally, right? So, but how the response of this event unfolded online. And also in what Anna was saying, in this response, in this hype, right? In this all sort of debates, what we see is how easily in the moment of the hardest moment of Ukrainian war, how easily the Russian subject gets the central place immediately, right? So that tells us, again, following what Anna said about who is being interviewed and why, that we indeed do not exist in the world. That narrative was, our inexistence was produced. It was produced by museums, titling paintings as Russian dancers when they are Ukrainian dancers, or Russian artists, where, like our inexistence was produced by numerous world institutions, universities, art institutions, media, and so on. That is why every Maria Ovsyannikova would be immediately the main subject of everything, no matter what kind of genocide you have at this moment in Ukraine. And that's what I've learned through that event.
Thank you, Svetlana. And maybe to build on that a little bit, so if we have Russian propaganda, how do you think the Western world should react to it, in terms of, should it be completely ignored and like not analyzed, or maybe analyzing it could bring some benefit of understanding where things are going?
I think it's important.
Yeah, go on.
Go ahead, please.
No, please, you first.
It's important to remember that one of the goals of propaganda is to pretend that it's not propaganda. So even just to analyze it and to tag it and to make sure that people understand that a piece of information that they had just heard or thought was true, or they heard from a friend, was to identify it as an actual piece of propaganda, and then importantly to say who was responsible for it. I think that that's very effective, because the minute you know who's responsible for it, then you can begin to make sense of why they did it, what their interest is. Propaganda, disinformation is created for a purpose. It's intentional. And so once we understand who's creating it, it can help us to understand why.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. And I'd like to also add my answer that's going to be really short. And I think that to answer that conundrum, we should just be aware that this alleged opposition between the West and Russia should be dispelled. I'm sorry, but Russia is West. Like, Russia is the bastard, like, is the bastard of the Western culture. Russia is actually a product of white settler colonialism, just most of so-called Western nations. Yeah, and so there is no such thing as Russian propaganda as opposed to Western propaganda. Just Russian propaganda is a bastard of what the West has created in the form of its like so-called public relations, discipline, and so on. Yeah, so that there is no such thing as this kind of Eurasian, Oriental, barbaric, Eastern Russia. This is Europe. This is European. This is a European problem, and Russian fascism is ultimately European fascism. So let's not try to distance ourselves from this problem.
Okay, we have another question coming from Instagram. Dear speakers, thank you for the amazing discussion. Oleksiy used the term fascism referring to Russian Federation. Svitlana mentioned that Russia acts as a terrorist state. Ukrainian and Western media started using the term Russism. Could you elaborate on the usage of a political terminology and how media creates new narratives out of it?
Should I start? Maybe, yeah, or Svitlana, do you want to start?
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that I really don't like the term Russism, whatever that means, because I think we should call things by their name, and the current political regime in the Russian Federation is fascism, plain and simple, and is like textbook definition of fascism on very many levels. It's now also fighting a fascist war against a neighboring country that is based on a denial of a right to exist that I've already described before. And there are so many other levels why it is quite obvious, at least for us here, that the current regime in Russia is openly fascist, starting from the fact that its official ideology, like really the official like ideologist in the Kremlin, is based on the writings of an openly fascist interwar Russian philosopher called Ivan Ilyin, who was a big sympathizer of Hitler even after 1945, and things like that. So I think that Russism, this kind of pseudo kind of term, is actually a spoiler, as a very misleading term, because I think we should really stick to the textbook definition of fascism that we see now in Russia.
I completely agree, and I really don't like the word Russianism, even though there is this tendency to specify, right? So the current events and to attach them, to attach these phenomena, these practices to a particular country. But I absolutely agree with Oleksiy that we need to stick to the book definition. And myself, I'm thinking a lot, not only about terrorism, this particular type of energy or nuclear terrorism, which we can call, and of which I started writing already with the first publication in Influx, where I just started engaging with theories of terrorism and thinking through the theories of terrorism and how this particular event fits and where it's in a way different and how it's actually part of that. But with fascism as well, so we see again what this particular discourse of purification or cleaning, right? So cleaning something, it's very important because what the fact that Ukrainians speak Russian language, many Ukrainians speak Russian language, etc., but still, as Oleksiy was saying before, but still do not identify with Russia, or is provoking, right? So provoking with this whole discourse that someone has to be cleaned, that is a book fascism, right? So this is a classical definition of fascism, that someone has to be cleaned, and the appearance of these filtration camps is one of the most probably symptomatic, most visible kind of practices. And what is done in these filtration camps, how the bodies are being searched and photographed, etc., that's where for the science of Nazism, right? So the Nazism is something Nazi, right? Some kind of Nazism, science of Nazism is thought to be on our bodies or inside our bodies. Just think about this horrifying idea, right? So we literally need to be turned inside down, and maybe all this rape craze has in a certain way to do with this, right? So our bodies has to be open and searched in the camps and through the war rape practices. And it's done to us because someone searches Nazism in us. And this is fascism.
Thank you for the answer. Do we maybe have a question in the audience here in the... no one. So I think we will wrap this up here. Thank you, Svitlana, Lee, Lera, Anna, Oleksiy. It was great to have you. And thanks for the people who came here. And we still have soup here that you can get for little donations. And yeah, I'm glad that this is this event happened. And for the panelists, I would like to ask you to stick around for a little bit in the Zoom call. We'll give you we'll do a little wrap up with you separately. And thank you.